Hey everyone, welcome. I'm Rachel Siegel, the Director of Jewish Women's Leadership Programs at Illuminate. Welcome to our Crown Jewel Conversation Series. Illuminate empowers Jewish feminist women leaders and philanthropists, advancing gender equity and social justice. We have created the Collective, our signature leadership advancement program, to train, support, elevate, and connect Jewish women's leadership globally to achieve the social change we seek. Illuminate invests in Jewish entrepreneurial women executives and leaders who are devoting their lives to tackling society's most pressing issues in the United States, Israel, and around the globe. Each year, we select 10 women to be in the Collective's cohort-based leadership advancement program. Our global network is now 60 women strong. Our conversation today features one of these incredible collective members. Avital Blonder is the CEO and founder of Jindas, Social Urban Vitalization. There, Avital spearheads multi-sector partnerships to advance social mobility and urban renewal among Israel's most marginalized communities. Before founding Jindas, Avital established and managed the student branches of Pa'amonim, Avital, you'll forgive me if I mispronounce, and founded Derech Lod, an initiative that brings young leaders and talented professionals to live, work, and volunteer in the city of Lod. Born in Jerusalem, Avital was active in the Israeli youth movement and served in the education corps of the Israeli army. She is an active alumna of the Ma'oz Fellowship Program, a former fellow at Kolot, and a current fellow of the Encounter Program that focuses on Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She holds a BA in psychology and a Mandel Social Leadership MBA from Ben-Gurion University. Please write down any questions that you have in the chat, and we will do our best to incorporate them if time allows. To begin the conversation, I'm pleased to introduce the immediate past president of Illuminate, Rachel Weinstein.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and hello, everyone. It's nice to see so many new faces here today. And Avital, I'm so looking forward to this conversation with you. I mean, obviously, Israel continues to be in the forefront of our minds and the headlines. And I think in talking to you today, our listeners are really going to hear about a part of Israel that they might not know about, that, isn't on your typical tourist travels. And, it's going to shed some light for us onto areas that we're not familiar with, specifically around underserved communities and the work you're doing around urban renewal. So first, I want to start by getting to know you a bit about, how did you get into the work of urban renewal and what led you to found Jindas?
So good evening here, or good afternoon for you. Thank you for taking the time. I see some familiar and loving faces, so thank you for joining. And thank you, Rachel for this great introduction. It's I've never would have been able to introduce myself this way, so thank you. I'll tell a little bit about my personal story because in some ways it has to do with what Jindas does today. So I am 41 as of last week, married to Yael, and we have three young kids. I grew up in Jerusalem in a modern Orthodox family that was always very much devoted to social change. My mother is a social worker. My father is a business developer. But in many ways, I'm kind of a hybrid junction between these two amazing people. But I always, being very Jewish, we have to always go back to history. So in many ways, my story today starts by saying that it's from Lodz to Lod in some ways, because my grandfather on my mother's side was a Holocaust survivor from Poland, finished the war at 19 years old, with literally no one on earth besides a second cousin of his father that survived, but literally no one else survived, and he was the only survivor of all of his great family from Poland. And he was a big mentor to me in being able to stay a mensch and at the same time have big dreams and make them a reality. So from lodge to lodge is meaning that I very much bear in mind the very rich history that we all have, but also the deep understanding that humanity is a very fragile thing, and if we don't keep it, it's not going to stay the way it is today. And we have a role to keep this legacy not only for ourselves but for future generations. And it's basically part of what I do from morning till night. So it's not necessarily that I study Jewish studies every day, even though I wish I would be able to. But the big learnings that we've got from an unbelievable rich lesson of Jewish history is very much part of the essence of what I do, which means caring to others. So that's how it started. I've been a social activist ever since I remember myself, since probably 15 years old. And up until probably less than 15 years ago, I was mainly involved in issues of welfare and education in Israel. And about in 2011, we had the Israeli version of Occupy Wall Street in Israel, and 500,000 people were going out in the streets and demonstrating for social justice in many ways, which was, for everyone who was very much devoted to this issue, was kind of a miracle. Like, where have you been, all of you, all this time? And suddenly we realized we share a vision with much more people than we've realized before. And part of this big movement led me to decide to move into a city called Lod, which is basically, in many ways at that time, was in some ways the dark side of the moon. So if you would Google Lod at that time, the only results you would get in 25 pages of Google was about crime, drug dealers, violence, tension between communities, being a mixed city, corruption, basically the worst image you can possibly imagine. But it's 25 minutes away from the city of Tel Aviv. So it's very hard to imagine that in such a proximity, there could be such huge differences. And I decided to move into the city of Lod, which wasn't a trivial decision to make, especially since I have a Jewish mother, so she wouldn't sleep at night. But they were all very much supportive of me moving there. And through living in this place and being part of the community, I realized over time what needs to be done. And now I have the privilege of replicating these lessons learned, not only to the city of Lod, but also for other cities in Israel. So that's in a nutshell who I am.
Amazing. And I think I'm going to ask you about that in a little bit, right? This idea that you became part of the community before advocating for change, this idea from within. So before we like explore what your work is, it would be great if we just share a common definition so that everyone here knows, can you define how you would define urban renewal?
Okay, so that's a great question, because you would hear probably different answers, especially when it comes to Israel. And also if you take into consideration the cultural differences between the US and Israel, so that needs an explanation.
Yeah.
Demands an explanation. So in Israel, if you would say התחדשות עירונית, which is the Hebrew words for urban renewal, the only thing people will have in mind is basically taking down dilapidated housing and building new ones instead, which is a crucial part of what we do. But when we think about urban renewal, we think it in a much broader sense of the way, which means that basically the neighborhood level is, I think, in many ways, what is going to define the future of every kid growing in each and every neighborhood. If I would give you enough, if I would introduce you 5 kids, 5 years old, and you wouldn't know anything about them in Israel besides one piece of information that is going to depict the best, it's going to give you the best indication of how much will they earn and when they will be 30 years old. Unfortunately, it's their zip code, which is the only thing they actually won't choose, because that's where they grew up and that's where they were born. And this situation is something that we deeply need to change in Israel. It's not the only place in the world that suffers from these issues, but in Israel, it's very much in an extreme situation. So when we're talking about urban renewal, it's basically on the neighborhood level, talking about creating the best possible place for people living in this area, which demands an approach not only about housing, but also about the development of the public space, the public services in the area, and basically the level of opportunities that people living in this area can actually get access to. And this is why when we started our work in Israel, in Lod, we were looking for a model that can really serve us, that was done previously before in other places, so we won't need to invent the wheel, where these kinds of changes happened, because we realized that taking down the existing dilapidated housing that unfortunately is basically all over this country is very much needed, but if this will be the only thing done, it won't work. And that's how we got to the United States and met a phenomenal American developer named Richard Barron almost 10 years ago already. And he has been doing this type of work in the lowest income neighborhoods all over the United States in the past 50 years, built more than 30,000 apartments in literally the lowest income neighborhoods in the United States. Started his work in the late 60s in St. Louis, Missouri, in a very much in a very low income neighborhood in St. Louis, but then spread now to more than 50 cities all over the United States. First time he met me, I thought he's going to give me an hour of his time. Turned out that it's got probably an hour a day ever since. But he told me he's almost 85 now. He's like a second father to me in many ways. And first time he met me, he said, "Listen, a few years ago on my bar mitzvah, I got my first Israeli bond for my grandfather with a promise that one day I'll do something in Israel. Can you help me fulfill my promise?" And that's how it started. And ever since, it really became a love story in so many ways, because we're basically taking the best of his work and translating it or transferring it and adapting it to the Israeli version of it, because there's lots of different mechanisms that very much exist in the States and don't exist here. So there was a need to create these platforms before we can actually start fulfilling the mission. But the mission, the essence stayed the same. And it's basically creating the best neighborhood possible for the one in need. And unfortunately, also in Israel, when we look at these neighborhoods, generally, not we Jindas, the city, the country in general, it's mainly redesigned for the future residents that are going to come, and not addressing the deep needs of the people living currently today in these neighborhoods. And over time, they're gentrified, and that's happening time and time again. And the whole approach behind what Jindas is achieving today is basically designing the best neighborhood possible for the needs of the current residents living there today. It does not mean that newcomers are not going to come, and it's actually very much important that they will come. But the question is, who is it designed for? Who are the main stakeholders? Who are the owners of these places?
I'm on a Zoom.
Oh, sorry.
I'm listening.
And if you design it for the people who live there first and foremost, the outcome would be being able to provide services also for the newcomers. But if you don't take into consideration the fact that these neighborhoods became poverty ghettos over time in Israel, and they're very much segregated economically, then we won't be able to provide the right services. So going back to your question, urban renewal demands an approach that takes care not only of the existing housing stock that needs to be redeveloped, but also about the different services around and all of the possibilities and opportunities that are very much missing in those areas.
Thank you so much. And I imagine that encompasses education and other infrastructure. And so, like, in the context of your definition, I'd love to now dive deeper to hear about, what specifically is the work that you're doing in these communities?
Okay, so I'll start with a few figures. I won't show a lot of graphs and charts because that's going to be a little boring, but I'll tell you just a few highlights to understand the differences of how Israel normally achieves versus what's actually going in the places we're operating and working with. So currently today, every fifth person in Israel lives in poverty. We have more than 20% of the country's population living in poverty, and the level of poverty in Israel is the lowest one in the whole OECD's countries. So unlike the general image of Israel being the high-tech nation and startup nation and all of that, which also exists in Israel, in the other side of Israel, sometimes, as you can see in much of geographical proximity, it's a whole different ballgame. And in many ways, it looks like a third world country. So that's one aspect of it. And I'll talk a little later about the effects of October 7th. I think, Rachel, we're going to talk about this later on. But unfortunately, this phenomenon became much more acute after October 7th. But to be honest, we had these issues much before October 6th. It just became worse. So that's one issue. Second issue, and also, as I've mentioned before, we tend to have segregated economic communities in Israel. So if you will ask the average Israeli, where does he live on a neighborhood level, you would probably be able to accurately guess what's his level of income according to the place of where he lives. So we used to be a very diverse country on the neighborhood level in terms of the socioeconomic range, and it's not the case anymore. We have around 200 neighborhoods that are in deep poverty in Israel, spread all over the country, but with a huge concentration in the north or in the south. So mainly not in high demanded areas. And in those areas, we have more than 50% of these neighborhoods populations that are earning less than minimum wages, and less than 13%, 1/3, have an academic degree of any sort. So this is basically the second Israel most people won't know about unless they were introduced to these issues. Second aspect of it is a huge housing crisis that Israel is going through in the past 20 years. Anyone who has an Israeli relatives that is trying to rent an apartment or buy an apartment in Israel has probably heard about it. Prices of real estate in Israel, when it comes to Tel Aviv, is the highest in the world. And basically, just to give you one figure that will give you a better understanding of it, 10 years ago, the average mortgage in Israel was $1,500. Currently today, after 10 years, it's $3,100, okay, on average, which is basically covering 100% average income of one single
You're
member
talking
of
about the
family.
monthly mortgage payments is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost triple its size. And the average income hasn't tripled. So the outcome is that we have a huge portion of the population that are spending much more than 50% of their income just on housing expenses. But when you combine these two phenomena of poverty together with the housing crisis in Israel, it's horrible for the lowest income communities, because the people we are serving in the communities we're operating in are expending about 60 to 70% of their income just on housing expenses, which leaves them probably about $700 to $800 for all the rest of their needs, which means food, education, medicine, any kind of service that they need out there, which is obviously not enough to maintain a decent life. So when you combine these two aspects and the fact that we're talking about segregated economic communities, it demands a holistic approach that serves all these aspects together. So as an outcome of that, and I won't share a lot of slides, but I think this will be, I talked about my personal story. I'll go back just for a second, just to give you an understanding. I started in the city of Lod, which is one of the lowest income communities in the country. And that's how it looked like, the neighborhood, when we started working there. And being a social entrepreneur, I'll get to Genius in a second. means that you have to be very much connected to the community you're operating in. And the first thing that was very obvious, that the amount of garbage spread all over the neighborhood is basically impossible to live in. And that's how we started. We started literally by collecting garbage with the kids in the neighborhood. But through them, we got connected to the parents. And when we asked the parents, what does change look like for you? We thought they're going to talk about education and employment, which they also talked about. But for our surprise, and again, I'm talking about 2011, so it's quite a while ago already, the main thing they talked about was housing. They said, we live in unbearable conditions, and the city and the community is growing while the stock in the neighborhood doesn't grow as well. So the area is basically underserved, and we don't have a future for our kids here. And that's how we got to know Richard Barron, because we were looking for a model that can, on one hand, massively enhance development and replace this dilapidated housing, and on the other hand, make sure that the community won't be gentrified, because there's going to be a massive appreciation of value of land. We're talking about a neighborhood that had no single private developers since 1948. All of the existing housing stock, which is very much a common thing to see in the neighborhood we're operating in, don't have any kind of private investments. It used to be public housing sold over time to the tenants and basically left untouched with no proper management and maintenance. And basically, that's how we got to do what we do. So basically, Jindas is a not-for-profit development company. It's easier for me to explain to Americans what we do rather than Israelis, because in Israel, we are the only one doing this, but you would probably know this by organizations that are CDCs, community development corporations. So we're getting in neighborhoods that are the lowest income neighborhoods in Israel, and that have very low land value, that don't have any incentives for private developers to be involved in. And in these areas, we're doing all these three aspects all together. So first and foremost, we're redeveloping the existing housing stock. We're organizing the residents, we're signing contracts, we're doing zoning, and which is also something to mention, because when it comes to these types of processes in Israel, and that's one of the reasons there's such a huge housing crisis, zoning in Israel takes 4 to 5 years on good days. I know it seems weird, but we're a very bureaucratic country when it comes to housing. So that's why it takes a very long while. Just to give you an understanding, since we started working with residents until they see their new housing, sometimes it takes 7 to 8 years. So it's a very long-term approach that is needed to serve these issues. But together with replacing the existing housing stock to the homeowners, we provide also affordable housing solutions, which means long-term rental mixed income that serves not only the homeowners, but also the renters, and making sure they're not gentrified because of the appreciation of land value. Second piece to our work is the fact that in each and every community, we establish a social task force that works with residents on the ground to make sure that on the private level, we create an appreciation of 30% of their income through social mobility programming that serves both employment opportunities and also utilizations of rights. And we actually achieved these goals till today. So we're serving currently now in Israel, I would say almost 800 households spread all over these communities from north to south. And being able to provide these services is a huge help for these families, because it's not only talking about the long-term approach of a new community that they're going to be rebuilt, but also how do I deal with the issues that I have now? People can't afford paying rent now. People can't afford paying electricity. People can't afford buying food. So it's a huge necessity to create these services immediately and not just wait for the long run for these redevelopment to happen. And last but not least is massive appreciation of the public space and facilities, because at the end of the day, if I'm an average family in Israel, before I ask how much it's going to cost me to buy or rent an apartment, the first thing I would ask is, what's the quality of the schools, the after-school programming in the area? How does the neighborhood look like? And if it looks like a dump hole, I wouldn't consider moving in there unless I don't have any other opportunities. So redeveloping these areas, as I've said before, demands not only serving the housing piece of it, but massive appreciation of the whole surrounding. Basically, in the next year to come, we're hoping to be in 8 cities. Currently, we are in 8, redeveloping or developing 4,000 new units, replacing about 1,000 existing units spread all over the country. Currently, under zoning, we have 3,200 units that we're actually designing now. So we're not very far away from the long-term vision that we're trying to fulfill. And as you can see, create a massive appreciation and the quality of life, both by the appreciation of the property value of these residents, but also by creating a lot more available income to these families. So it's always a combination between all of these aspects. Here you can have a better look a little bit about the impact of what we've been able to achieve so far, both in 2024 and in previous years. And just last but not least, for it to be a little more tangible, here's an example of one of our projects in the city of Ofakim, which was very much hurt by October 7th. Unfortunately, 52 residents of the city were killed by a terrorist attack of Hamas on October 7th in the city of Ofakim, just next to our neighborhood. And it's one of the lowest income neighborhoods in Israel, and definitely the lowest income one in the city of Ofakim. We're going to be building there 690 new apartments. One thing to mention is that in Israel, unless your building was built after 1990, you don't have a safe room. This law was only integrated in Israel after 1990, which means that all of the old neighborhoods we're serving don't have safe rooms. So if until October 6th, we were talking about the deep necessity to redevelop these areas for the issues of social mobility and quality of life, now it's actually life itself. And because there's no feasibility for private developers to be redeveloping these areas, they don't have safe rooms. So we currently have this crazy situation that you have more safe rooms in Tel Aviv and Petah Tikva than Ashkelon and Ofakim, even though they suffered much more the huge and Kiryat Shmona from the horrible attacks, both in the north and the south. So for us, urban renewal is also life itself and not just social mobility and quality of life. But as you can see, we're going to massively appreciate the public space, public facilities, etc. So it's a very holistic approach towards changing the natures of these areas.
Avital, it's incredible. I mean, it's incredible the work that you're doing. There's so many questions that have been generated from, I mean, no, first and foremost, well, not first and foremost, first, can you tell us a little bit about the demographic of these communities and how you engage them in the renewal process? So are they immigrants? Are they Jewish? Are they Palestinian? Like who are they?
Okay, so first of all, I think there isn't a single community we don't work with in Israel, because these communities is basically a reflection of all of the diversity of the state of Israel. So we work with the Ethiopian community, with the Arab Palestinian community, we work with the Russian community, we work with the Ukrainian community, the North African original community, basically everyone. So beside the high-tech industry, which doesn't really need our services, we almost work with everyone. As you've been able to see, we work from north to south. So it really is covering, I think, the vast majority of Israel's population. But as I've said before, the residents we're serving are only low income. So they're diverse in terms of their background, but what makes them all the same in that sense is the level of huge challenge they're suffering from in Israel, and that's why they need our support. Second question, sorry, remind me again.
And it sounds like you set up these task forces.
Oh yeah.
Engage them in the
now.
process.
How do
and
we
did you
reach out
say
to them?
that they contribute 30% of their income to this project?
No, they appreciate their
they
income
appreciate.
through our
Okay.
programs.
Got it.
The income goes to them, not to us. That's how it should be. That's the reason we do what we do. But one thing to mention is that the whole community approach that we apply is that our community members are part of the community itself. So whenever we start working with a community, and we start basically engaging the community. It's done by members of the communities themselves who are hired by us. So there's not a lot of need for massive marketing, for example. It's more of a long-term trust building process. So it's literally knocking on each and everyone's door, but not once, but probably once a week over probably 1 to 2 years until they say, okay, you actually keep your promises. You're still here, because we're used to people who are coming and they disappear after a year. So it takes a while, because these residents tend to hear promises time and time again, and nothing actually happens. In the vast majority of the cases, everyone failed them, unfortunately. And that's why the way we operate is always, there's a deep need for a long-term process. It's not going to happen within a night. That's why we're there for the next 10 to 15 years in each community, because otherwise it's not going to work. So this whole exit strategy after 3 years doesn't work for us, not in those areas. And it needs a long-term devotion to make it a reality. But the key, going back to your question, is to be very much attentive and dedicated to the needs of the community. And the only way to do that is to organize the community through the community itself, and practice the most important lesson of community organizing, which is nothing about us without us. We never take decisions on the community without the community being involved. They're the experts. They know best what they need. Sometimes they won't know how to apply it in a design. They won't know how to apply it in the more bureaucratic language of zoning, etc. But they know best what's missing. So the whole approach is a massive investment in public participation, and they become our partners in many ways, and we try to serve them their needs best. And that's why, even though everyone are low income in terms of the communities we serve, it looks very different from one community to another in terms of the need, and also the approach and the dynamics. So that's different in that sense.
And how are you paying for all this? Is it all through private fundraising? Are you getting public money from the government? Like how are you making this all happen?
So one of the things that are key to understand, that in Israel, unlike tax credits or choice neighborhood, Hope 6, there's a zillion names to it. But at the end of the day, you have different kinds of American mechanisms that really supports these types of work in the States. And as crazy as this might sound, in Israel, there isn't a single government program that supports that. We don't have a program for affordable housing. And when it comes to urban renewal, just to give you the figures, since the establishment of these developments dated probably 15 years ago in Israel, in the district of Tel Aviv and the center of Israel, there's 140,000 units being approved in urban renewal processes. So basically taking down existing buildings, reinforcing them, and building new ones. During the same period of time, in the whole district of the north of Israel, there's 1,600 units being approved. That's the difference. It's 1% of the city's center. So the differences between the high demanded areas where the value of land is sky high versus the areas we're operating in is like it's like an ocean in between them, even though sometimes it's like half an hour drive one area from another. So for this to be successful, we apply a blended financing approach, which means basically that everything we do is a combination between philanthropy, impact investment, government grants, and equity and debt, which comes from private development, so that it all blends together. But in each and every project, basically, there's always a gap. If it makes sense financially for private developers to be doing this, we won't be there. There's no need for us. We're going into places that the numbers wouldn't add up. And then that's why it's not happening. So we bear the risk on our shoulders, and we do it gladly. Otherwise, we won't be needed. And we basically bridge the risk so that then the private developers can join forces with us together with government funding. So just in a nutshell, for each and every project, we raise $2 million to start with, half philanthropy and half impact investments that supports our work for the first 5 years. During that, we organize the community, we sign contracts, we do zoning, we make the project mature and viable. At the same period of time, we make sure that there is access for government grants and philanthropy that fill in the gap so that the numbers would adapt. And unlike a regular development company, we provide these social mobility programs to the residents so that they can really change the nature of their quality of life. So that after 5 years, these $2 million are being leveraged phenomenally, because on average, the cost of the project once it's been executed is probably closer to $200 million. Okay, that's what philanthropy can create. And philanthropy in many ways, and in that sense, it really doesn't matter if it's impact investment or philanthropy, because anyway, as I say to our investors, there's much easier to make money than investing in agendas, but it's probably the best way to fix the world. So the level of returns are 5% a year, unlike the regular business investment in the real estate sectors in Israel. But over time, basically these $2 million become a huge investment in very much underserved communities. And every supporter that we're blessed to have is literally have real access to rebuilding this country. And just one last sentence about this. You know, the housing in Israel actually started with a phenomenal American developer from St. Louis called Izzy Millstone. Maybe some of you are familiar with him. He died at 103. And he brought to Ben Gurion at the time the practice of prefabricated housing, because the government had to build a lot quick and cheap within a very short period of time, because he had ways of aliyah in a very short period of time in a country that literally had no access to resources, and definitely very far away than where Israel is today. But still, we were 5th in the world in the number of public housing units per capita at that time, in the late 60s and early 70s. And basically, ever since the 80s, the government stepped out of this model of having this notion that housing is a basic necessity for people. People need a place to live, and the government stepped out of it. And I think the role that the US community played in building this country, literally, and this also dates back to Project Renewal, which I assume many of you are familiar with, and a lot of the partnership with Federation are still dating back to this initiative to begin with. So big movements in Israel started in many ways from the US diaspora towards Israel. Same goes to this such crucial decision of approving the aliyah of the Jewish Ethiopian families that the US Jewry had huge influence on. It wouldn't happen without you. So I think that a lot of our US supporters, and we're blessed to have many of them, have this notion that building Israel is not just a one-time thing. It's a continuous process. And we have to go back to the same neighborhoods and rebuild them again, because otherwise, and especially after October 7th, Israel won't be strong just by its army. Yeah. Israel will be strong by the quality of life of the people living here and wanting to tie their future to this place. And as long as 20% of Israel's population is suffering from such deep poverty, we can't look ourselves in the eyes and say, this is a Jewish country. Seriously. Yeah. That's part of our values. And I truly believe that the reason my grandparents came to live in Israel is because they visioned in mind that the Jewish state won't have these kinds of approach towards low-income families. It's part of our role. So this is what we do.
Amazing. And I have so much I want to talk to you about from a zoomed out perspective about Israel also in this moment. But let me ask you a few rapid fire questions that have come in from people. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is incredible. And I think for Americans to see how far the dollar goes for these projects in Israel is incredible. How big is your team? I mean, it sounds like you need a full army just to execute this. So how big is your team?
Well, if we would be a normal organization, we would probably hire 60 people, but we're actually 14.
Oh my goodness.
Amazing. So we're very busy and doing diverse work.
when you build these new housing developments, number one, do people need to apply to live there? And what happens to people while you're building them? Are they living in their existing homes? Are they displaced? How does that work?
So first of all, on a regular basis, when it's urban renewal in dense areas such as Tel Aviv, there's no privilege like ours that having a vacant piece of land just next to our housing site. So when it comes to the lowest income neighborhoods we're operating in, there's no value for the land, but there is actually access for land, which is a huge benefit, which gives us the ability to only first build on the vacant land, just in proximity to the existing housing site. People are then moving in perpetuity to the new housing, and only then we take down the existing housing stock, which gives us a huge benefit in terms of the stability of the community. People won't need to go way outside of the neighborhood and then only come back. So in Hebrew, it's called binui, pinui, binui. We first build, then we take down the existing stock and we rebuild. And that's how we keep the community safe during the time of the construction. And sorry, again, what was the other question? Sorry, Rachel.
No, I think you got it. Well, do people need to apply to live in these?
No,
Or
we serve the existing community, which
Okay.
means that whether you're a homeowner or a public housing renter or just a free renter in the private market, we serve you because you live there. And we serve the community living in the neighborhood. Doesn't really matter. I mean, obviously, if you're a newcomer 5 seconds before we house the new housing stock with affordable housing, you won't get access to it because we want to serve the community that was there to begin with.
right,
But
right.
every resident living in the neighborhood have access to our services.
Yeah. And do you find that when you are investing in the communities, that then the communities take it over in terms of the upkeep? Are you having to, I mean, I know you're saying you're there for 10 years, but how about the maintenance of this
That's how
renewal?
we measure our success.
Yeah,
Because for me, it's one thing to create a success that can be the physical success of it, which is obviously very easy to see. But the secret sauce would be what's going to happen over time, not only in terms of management and maintenance of these facilities, but also in terms of the level of people's attention and devotion and connection to the place they live in. One of the reasons there's so much garbage in these neighborhoods is because people don't feel at home in their own neighborhood, even though they grew up there since childhood, because the public space has been neglected since forever. And for them, it's like a message that nobody takes care of us. So why bother? Anyway, it's going to look like a dump hole. And when you redevelop these areas, the key is to create a sense of ownership to these places, not by us, but by them. But it's done in baby steps. It's like a child, you start by making the best atmosphere you can create for them to feel that they've been loved and cared. And then gradually over time, the community grows and creates bigger abilities for them to realize their own potential. Now, one of the key things that we apply when it comes to community building processes is that we use the practice of participatory budgets, which means that part of the fundraising that we do is giving access to funds that are not designated, but for the residents to take decisions of what will be done with those funds. Why is it important? First of all, to practice what we preach for and say, this is yours, it's not ours. We bring you access to sources, but it's yours. But more importantly, that's how they realize that they can actually create success. So they have the committees that we're establishing in each community we're serving is basically deciding. I'll give you one example in Lod to start with. So 2 years ago, we established a committee about education because this was something that was very much concerning the families in the neighborhood. We started with 19 members. In this case, you won't be surprised, it was mainly mothers because they are mostly in charge of the education of the kids. So they see in front of their eyes the problems and the potential. And it took us about a year to get them to come to the meetings. And in many ways, all of the members of the committee were all part of the same neighborhood, but they didn't know each other, even though they live 50 meters away from one another. So for a whole year, it was only to get them to come to the meetings. Then they decided they're going to be focusing on education. And then we started giving them access to tools of knowledge and know-how and information of what does the education system looks like, what they can actually change, what they can't, what's on the neighborhood level, what's on the city level, what's on the federal level, national level here, and how things are actually done, but also giving them actual tools of how to be an activist, how to change your own neighborhood, how to build a plan to a project. And then we said, you have about $10,000 that you can decide what you want to do with. And they decided to start the first after school program to kids in the neighborhood. It started by a karate class designated for 20 kids. 30 seconds after, it became 60 kids. For 90% of these kids, it was the only after school program they ever attended, just to give you an understanding. And we just paid for it, but they designed it. They choose the teacher, they choose the location. They basically went from one family to another to just let them know that this is an actual opportunity. And it was such an unbelievable success that a few amazing things happened ever since. First of all, they said, you know what? We can actually do much more. Let's reach out to the principal of the schools of the kid and ask him, how can we be involved in the education of our kids? It's our kids, it's our facility. Let's change the nature of this place. But not less importantly, ever since, every community gathering that we have in the neighborhood, just to give you an understanding, on average, it's at least once a month with about 200 residents attending. So it's big events. They organize it 100%. We don't do anything. They design it. They invite the residents. They manage it. They do the whole production themselves. Again, I'm talking about members that didn't want to show up to meetings. Okay, that's how it started.
Yeah,
and now we have a range of 180 kids going once a week to after school programming in the neighborhood, but everything by this was designed by the parents. So that's the notion of creating a sense of trust of, first of all, not only towards us, but towards themselves and their ability to lead change. And that's a key thing when it comes to organizing a community. And this will be sustainable over time. That's going to stay.
Amazing. I mean, Avital, obviously your work was needed before, but nothing is in a vacuum and everything has been affected by October 7th. So what shifts have you seen? What new challenges for your community? How has your work been impacted by October 7th?
Okay, so I'll start by stating the obvious and saying that safe room was never a privilege in Israel, but it became a crucial necessity in the past 2 years. So everyone that doesn't have access to a safe room in Israel had a horrible life in the past 2 years, but some people had a much worse than others because it depended on the level of how many attacks and alarms were they, and sometimes it would be 3 times an hour. Okay, I'm not talking something that happens every second or third day. And when it comes to places like Ashkelon, in one of our communities, since the alarm starts, you have 25 seconds to go into a safe room. Now, if you have a community shelter, you won't have access to it because if you live in the 4th floor and you don't have elevators, you won't get in there in 25 seconds, especially if you're a single mother and you have to take 4 of your kids, and within 25 seconds, it will never happen. So they stayed at home. And many of them were severely attacked in their own buildings without having any other alternative of places to go. So that's the first aspect of it. Urban renewal in Israel, as I've said before, is the main key today to create shelters in Israel, safe rooms. And 100% of the community we're serving don't have access to safe rooms and will have new safe rooms as part of the new development. So that's one key issue. And the need is all over the country. So one of the things we've added to the work because of these aspects is the fact that we started influencing national policy, because we're going to be redoing 8 communities. But this is, as I've said, about 5% of this national phenomena, which means that the country will need to take our project as a demonstration project and then replicate it by many others. And this is why when people ask us, are we afraid to be replicated? I said, God bless, we need 50 others like us. We need more nonprofit organization going into these communities and serving them. So that's one aspect of it. Second is the fact that there's so much an army can do. And I know a lot of U.S. jury were very much involved during the first weeks and month of the war in trying to get access to soldiers in different kinds of I don't know, vest and whatever, which was very much crucial at the time. But over time, the strength of the country of Israel and the strength of its border is not going to be die by an army. And many of you that are familiar with the history of this country, the reason 100 years ago, people decided moving to kibbutzim and moshavim and cities in the north and the south, is with the deep understanding that the border will be defined by the last resident living. And the fact that Kiryat Shmona was evacuated for a year and a half, which is unheard of until 2 years ago, nobody would have believed that this would happen, basically created a situation that the border was just before the city's entrance. That's literally what happened when people are evacuating. You don't have a city, nobody's there. And for us to rebuild this country after the horrible events of October 7th is not only by security aspect, but also by building great communities for people to decide moving into these places and not to worsen the situation when it comes to the lowest income communities. And last but not least is the fact that because of unbelievable challenges that this country went through in the past year and a half, the level of poverty of our communities has become much worse. So we work more hours a day, and it's not to say that we were bored before, but we really see a deep necessity out there, and we're blessed to see the impact of seeing the relief of people once we start working with the residents.
Avital, we're butting up against time here, so I'm going to ask you just a couple more questions. I'd also love for you to talk about what shifts you've noticed about the Jews in diaspora post October 7th and how we can support you at this time.
So one of the new things I've learned a few months ago is the new expression of October 8th Jews, which I assume part of you are familiar with, which for me was a new thing. But what we did sense in Israel, and here I'm talking not only as Agenda's CEO, but also as an Israeli member and part of the Jewish community in the world, is that there was kind of a wake-up call, I think October 7th created, in saying, I am attached to this place. Doesn't matter if my zip code is in New York or in Israel, in Tel Aviv or wherever else. And it demands these kinds of questions that needs to be re-asked, what this connection means. It has to do with the history, but also with the future. And what kind of a future we envision to this place is not just a decision for us Israelis to make, but also for you. You're part of us. You will always be part of us. This place is not only for Israelis, this place is for all of Jews all over the world. And by that, I'll say that your deep connection to Israel means also being engaged. And like a child, you always say you love them, but sometimes you think different than them. And that's great. If we would all think the same, it would be horrible. And we need you. We need to hear your voice. We need your attention to this place. And we need your sense of ownership to this place because you're part of us. And we need to hear your voice. So supporting Israel is not just saying, I love Israel. Supporting Israel is saying, I care about this place. And when you do mistakes, and we do mistakes, we're here to say things should be done differently. And when it comes to leaving behind the lowest income communities in Israel, I'm sure you care about this just as much as we do. And when we do mistakes about this, we need to hear your voice to do it in a different way. how can you be involved? So specifically about Jindas, I would say that in each and every project, we build a giving circle to each project with, again, the goal of raising $2 million per project over 5 years. So it's a, in this, the giving circle is basically serves as like a mini board to a project, which makes it very tangible. So when people are involved, they love coming once or twice a year and say, wow, I see things are changing. And you can see the process over time, which makes it very nice. So there's physical changes, but also you can meet the residents and see how this community starts to flourish and things are starting to change. So our goal and our hope is that these mini boards will always be a combination between people from the US and people from Israel, which is also a great way to be engaged in Israel and meet the great people living here and very much devoted to social change. We're blessed to have a very active board in Israel that come from different kind of backgrounds, but bring their knowledge and know-how and how to do best what we do. But I would say that the people that are engaged to our work from a very diverse background. Some of them are involved in social change. Some of them are involved in zoning and architecture. Some of them are involved in finance and housing. It's very diverse, and we're blessed to have them as part of our communities of supporters.
This is amazing, and we could talk for a whole nother hour and cover so many more things. But I think I want to finish up by just asking you about your experience with Illuminate and specifically the collective, the other women you've met, how it's impacted your leadership, how you've leveraged relationships.
So I would say probably something that is not new to any one of you, that being a CEO is probably the loneliest role in the world. By being a CEO of a nonprofit organization is even lonelier. And for me, Illuminate is first and foremost being part of a group of people who are sharing the same concerned wishes and opportunities to make this world a better place. And sometimes when we walk around in the world, we look like a rare species. But when it comes to being part of Illuminate, suddenly people all looks the same, even though they do very different things. But we share this deep passion of leaving the world to be a better place for future kids and grandchildren in different kinds of ways, and we learn a lot from each other. And the other aspect of it is the fact that for me, goes back to the earlier piece of our conversation, there's always a deep connection between being a Jew and being a social activist. That's the fulfillment, or at least a portion of it, of me being a Jew. And creating these common languages between women who are having a deep devotion for social change as part of their Jewish identity is something that I learn a lot from, and I'm blessed to be part of this group.
Thank you. We're blessed to have you as part of our circle, and we're very grateful for the work that you're doing. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. I'm going to turn it over to Rachel.
Yes, thank you so much, Avital, for taking the time to share your story and teach us about urban renewal. And thank you for the important work you're doing. We're so proud to have you as a member of the collective and supporting your leadership. Thank you, Rachel, for leading us through this conversation today. We're putting a few links in the chat to learn more about Jindas and ways that you can get involved with Avital and her work and learn more. Please save the date for Illuminate's annual luncheon on May 13th and sign up for our upcoming Crown Jewel conversation that Eva will put in the chat. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.